Some people don't feel lost because their life is falling apart. They feel lost because everything is working, and something still feels missing. Ethan had spent more than a decade writing code. 12 years of building systems, fixing bugs, optimizing performance, releasing versions that were always better than the last. His career made sense on paper. Senior software engineer, stable income, respectable title, a trajectory most people would call success. And yet, there was a quiet question that kept resurfacing. No matter how much progress he made, it didn't shout, it didn't panic, it simply waited. When does it actually begin? He asked it after promotions. He asked it when he switched companies. He asked it when a long-term relationship ended and everyone told him. This is for the best. Each time. The question came back wearing a different mask. But it carried the same weight. A subtle sense that he was always standing just outside something important. As if life itself had paused him at the threshold. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. His days were structured. His calendar was full. His work was challenging in the way he'd been trained to value. Problems came in. Solutions went out. Logic in, logic out. Clean, predictable, efficient. But inside, there was a growing sense of repetition. Not boredom, not dissatisfaction. Something quieter and harder to name. A feeling that the scenery kept changing, but the internal state never did. In software, repetition is normal. Loops are everywhere. You write them deliberately. You expect them. A loop runs until a condition changes. Then it stops. That's how systems evolve. But somewhere along the way, his own life had started behaving like a loop without an exit condition. Different job titles, different teams, different cities, same emotional aftertaste. Always almost, always next. He didn't think of it as being stuck. He thought of it as being responsible, rational, strategic. He was good at explaining why things had unfolded the way they had. Good at telling a story that made sense. Good at convincing himself that the next move would finally be the one that unlocked everything. And that belief kept him moving. Productive, focused, quietly restless. What he didn't realize was that beneath all the conscious decisions, beneath all the planning and optimization, something else had been running uninterrupted for years. A hidden script, a default state, a probability lock. Not imposed by fate or circumstance, but generated internally. Reinforced every time he chose what felt familiar over what felt true. The lock wasn't dramatic. It didn't restrict his options. It didn't block opportunities. It simply selected the same kind of outcome again and again. Safety disguised as progress. Stability mistaken for alignment. He wasn't failing. He was looping. And the most dangerous thing about that kind of loop is that it feels like you... Then one evening, after a long day of debugging a system that refused to behave the way the models predicted, he found himself staring at the screen longer than usual, not thinking about the code, not thinking about the fix, just noticing something strange. The problem wasn't that the system was broken. It was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. The issue was the design itself. That thought lingered longer than it should have. A few days later, during a conversation that seemed casual at first, someone asked him a question he wasn't prepared for. If everything stayed exactly the same for the next 5 years. They said, "Would you still feel like you were becoming who you're meant to be?" He opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. For the first time in a long while, there was no immediate response in his mind. No justification, no plan, no narrative ready to deploy. Just a brief, unfamiliar pause. It lasted only a second, maybe less. But something shifted in that silence. Something loosened. That pause was not an answer. It was a crack. From that moment on, small things began to feel slightly off. Not wrong, just misaligned. Reactions that once came automatically now arrived a beat late. Decisions he would have made without hesitation suddenly felt optional. He didn't feel lost. He felt observant, as if he'd stepped half a pace back from his own behavior and was seeing it from a new angle. He hadn't changed his life yet, not externally. Nothing dramatic had happened, but internally. The system was no longer running invisibly. The script had become noticeable. And once you notice a script, it loses its authority. You're no longer just inside the loop. You're aware of it. What he didn't know yet was that this awareness wasn't a breakdown. It was the first signal of a quantum sensitivity beginning to emerge. The early indication that the probability lock was weakening. The sign that the timeline he'd been unconsciously reinforcing for years was starting to lose its grip. He was still writing code, still attending meetings, still showing up to a life that looked unchanged from the outside. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The question he'd been asking for years was no longer demanding an answer. It was dissolving on its own. And that was the first time he sensed that the loop might not be permanent after all. Once the pause appeared, it didn't disappear. It began showing up in unexpected places, in conversations, in meetings, in moments that used to trigger immediate reactions. He would feel it as a slight delay between stimulus and response, like a system buffering before executing a command. At first, it felt inconvenient. Then it felt revealing. He started noticing how often his choices followed the same internal logic, even when the circumstances were different. He had always believed he was making rational decisions based on data, experience, and foresight. But now, watching himself from this small distance, he saw something else at play. A preference for the familiar, a subtle avoidance of uncertainty, a quiet loyalty to outcomes that felt known, even when they no longer felt fulfilling. That's when the repetition became undeniable. Different companies, same conversations, different roles, same emotional tension, different relationships, same ending disguised with new details. It wasn't déjà vu in the dramatic sense. It was deeper than that. A sense that life kept reusing the same emotional template, just rendering it with updated graphics. In engineering, when a system keeps producing the same output despite changes in input, you don't blame the data. You look for the underlying constraint, the rule that's silently overriding everything else. And slowly, he began to recognize that his life had been governed by a similar constraint. Not imposed from the outside, but generated internally. A probability lock. The lock didn't limit his options. It filtered them. Out of countless possible directions, his consciousness kept selecting the same narrow band of outcomes. Not because they were best, but because they felt predictable, safe, compatible with the identity he had been reinforcing for years. The identity of someone who was capable, prepared, almost there, but never quite across the line. What made this realization unsettling wasn't the pattern itself. It was how invisible it had been. While he was inside it, everything felt natural, logical, even inevitable. The loop didn't announce itself. It blended into his personality, his habits, his explanations. It felt like him. Then came the subtle disturbances. He began noticing moments where reality seemed to hesitate. Conversations would unfold with sentences he swore he'd heard before. Situations would arise that felt strangely familiar, not because they were identical, but because they carried the same emotional charge, the same tension, the same unresolved pull. These weren't coincidences. They were temporal echoes, small reflections of a repeating timeline brushing up against its own edges. Time itself started behaving oddly. Hours disappeared during tasks that no longer mattered, while minutes stretched during moments that challenged his old patterns. He would walk into rooms and feel an inexplicable sense of having already been there. Not physically, but energetically. As if his consciousness was skimming the surface of experiences it had already rehearsed. Instead of feeling confused, he felt alert. He wasn't losing control. He was gaining visibility. The architecture of his own timeline was becoming perceptible. The repetition wasn't punishing him. It was showing him something. A feedback mechanism. A mirror held up long enough for him to finally see what frequency he'd been unconsciously broadcasting. And with that awareness came a quiet shift. The lock didn't break. It loosened. He noticed that some reactions no longer landed. Emotional triggers that once hijacked his attention lost their urgency. He didn't suppress them. They simply didn't hook into him the same way. It was as if the emotional code that powered the loop was beginning to decay. This new sensitivity wasn't anxiety. It wasn't hypervigilance. It was clarity. He could sense the direction a situation was moving before it fully formed. He could feel when a conversation was about to repeat an old dynamic. And for the first time, he didn't step into the role automatically. He paused, observed, chose differently, or chose not to choose at all. That's when he realized something crucial. The timeline wasn't changing because he was forcing it to. It was destabilizing because his internal state was no longer fully synchronized with it. The frequency that had once anchored him to the loop was shifting. And when consciousness changes frequency, the timeline that depends on that frequency begins to lose coherence. He didn't have language for it yet, not quantum, not spiritual, just experiential. A sense that the old system was still running, but it no longer recognized him as the same user. Permissions were changing. Access was being revoked. He hadn't jumped timelines, not yet. But he had stepped far enough back to see the loop for what it was. And once you see a loop clearly, you can no longer pretend it's the whole world. You know there's an exit condition somewhere, even if you don't know how to reach it yet. That knowing didn't bring certainty. It brought something quieter and more powerful. Choice. As the loop loosened, something else began to sharpen. It wasn't louder thoughts or stronger emotions. It was the opposite. A heightened quiet. A clearer signal beneath the noise. He started sensing things before they fully happened. Not as predictions, but as directions. The way a system begins to reveal its next state before the transition completes. He would walk into meetings and feel the outcome before anyone spoke. Not the details, but the trajectory. Support or resistance, expansion or contraction. He noticed how certain conversations carried the same emotional gravity as past ones, even when the people were different. And now, instead of stepping into that gravity, he could feel it without being pulled. This was new. He wasn't trying to be intuitive. He wasn't searching for meaning. The sensitivity emerged on its own, as if awareness itself had widened just enough to see the underlying structure of experience. He began trusting that subtle knowing more than the endless analysis he'd relied on for years. Not because it felt mystical, but because it was accurate. Then his dreams changed. They became vivid, but not chaotic, structured, deliberate. He found himself moving through unfamiliar spaces that felt purposeful rather than symbolic. Long corridors, open staircases, rooms filled with light but no furniture. These places didn't feel imaginary. They felt functional, like interfaces. In the dreams, he was different. Not braver, not more confident in a dramatic way. Just settled. He moved without second-guessing. He made decisions without rehearsing outcomes. There was no urgency, no sense of proving anything. He acted as if he already belonged wherever he was when he woke up. The details faded quickly, but the feeling stayed. A grounded clarity in his chest, a calm certainty in his posture. As if some other version of him had lent him its internal state for a few hours, and his nervous system remembered it. He didn't talk about the dreams. He didn't analyze them. He simply noticed how his waking life began to shift around their residue. Decisions felt lighter. Hesitation shortened. The constant background tension he'd carried for years began dissolving in small, almost unnoticeable increments. It occurred to him, one morning, that the dream state was doing something his waking mind couldn't. When his identity relaxed during sleep, consciousness gained access to possibilities normally blocked by habit and memory. The part of him that clung to the old timeline went quiet, and something more advanced stepped forward. Not a fantasy self, not an idealized future, but a version of him that already knew how to move differently. This realization unsettled him at first. He had always believed that growth moved forward in time, that you worked toward a future version of yourself step by step. But now it felt reversed, as if a future state of coherence was reaching backward, influencing the present, as if causality wasn't a straight line, but a loop that could be entered from multiple points. Around this time, he found himself reading less about productivity and optimization, and more about systems at the edge of science, consciousness, observation, quantum behavior. Not searching for answers, just following curiosity. One idea stood out more than the rest. In quantum physics, particles don't exist in a single state until they're observed. They exist as probabilities, potential outcomes. An observation doesn't just reveal reality, it participates in selecting it. He paused when he read that. If that was true at the smallest scales, what did it mean for a human life? What did it mean for identity, for choice? For the feeling of being trapped in patterns that seemed logical but never quite satisfying? He began to sense that his dreams weren't escapes from reality. They were rehearsals, training grounds, where consciousness practiced operating without the weight of the old identity, where a different internal frequency could be felt, embodied, and slowly integrated. This wasn't spiritual awakening in the dramatic sense. There were no visions, no declarations, just a growing familiarity with a quieter, steadier version of himself. One that didn't rush, didn't wait, didn't ask when life would begin. That version was already moving. And the more he recognized it, the less power the old timeline had to pull him back. He hadn't jumped yet, but the direction was no longer unclear. The system was recalibrating. The realization didn't arrive as a conclusion. It surfaced as a pattern he could no longer ignore. He began noticing that certain outcomes seemed to form before he consciously decided anything at all. not in a mystical way, in a practical, almost mechanical sense. A meeting would end exactly the way it had felt it would, long before the conversation started. A decision would unfold with an ease or resistance that had already been present in his body before his mind weighed in. It was unsettling at first. He had spent his entire career believing that clarity came from thinking things through, that better decisions were the result of better reasoning. But now, reasoning felt late, secondary, as if the real decision had already been made somewhere deeper, and his thoughts were just writing the justification afterward. In software engineering, he understood this phenomenon well. Systems don't respond to commands in isolation. They respond to state. The same input produces radically different outcomes depending on the condition the system is in when the command is executed. You don't fix that by rewriting the command. You fix it by changing the state. That analogy stayed with him. He began seeing his own consciousness as a system running in a particular state. A state shaped by years of emotional conditioning, identity reinforcement, and repeated experiences. And that state was quietly selecting outcomes long before intention or effort entered the picture. This was when the idea of quantum selection stopped being abstract. In physics, observation doesn't simply reveal a particle's position. It collapses probability into form. But collapse isn't the first step. Selection happens before observation. A narrowing of possibilities based on coherence, compatibility, and resonance. He felt that principle playing out in his own life. When his internal state carried tension, even well-planned actions led to friction. When his state felt grounded, events aligned with minimal effort. The difference wasn't what he did. It was who he was being when he did it. This explained something that had always bothered him. Why forcing outcomes rarely worked, even when he followed all the right steps. Why visualizing success from a place of strain only seemed to reinforce distance rather than closeness. Why chasing a future version of himself kept that version perpetually out of reach. Chasing assumed separation, becoming dissolved it. He realized that most of his life, he had been selecting timelines unconsciously, not through desire, but through identity. The version of himself that believed things were always about to start had been faithfully choosing a reality where they never quite did. And now, without effort, that selection was changing. Not because he decided to change it, but because the internal frequency that powered the old selection was no longer stable. The dreams, the pauses, the growing sensitivity, all of it had shifted his state enough that the old timeline no longer matched. He noticed how different it felt to act from this new state. There was less urgency, less need to prove. Choices emerged cleanly, without internal negotiation. He wasn't waiting for confirmation. He was responding to coherence. This wasn't blind trust. It was alignment. For the first time, he understood why so many people got stuck trying to manifest outcomes that never arrived. They were speaking one language with their words and broadcasting another with their state. The quantum field didn't respond to what they wanted. It responded to what they embodied. And embodiment didn't come from effort. It came from familiarity. The version of him that felt steady, clear, and unhurried wasn't something he was trying to become. It was something he was remembering. A frequency he was learning to hold, first in fragments, then for longer stretches of time. As that frequency stabilized, something subtle but unmistakable began to happen. The old timeline stopped arguing with him. Situations that once resisted his movement simply fell away. Certain paths closed without drama. Others opened without announcement, not as rewards, but as reflections. The world wasn't changing to accommodate him. It was rearranging itself to match him. He no longer asked whether he was doing enough. That question belonged to a different state. Now, the only thing that mattered was whether he was aligned with the version of himself that already knew how to move forward. And every time he chose from that alignment, the signal grew cleaner. The selection became clearer. The jump hadn't happened yet. But it was no longer a question of if. It was a matter of coherence catching up to form. The shift didn't arrive with a decision. It arrived as relief. He noticed it first in the absence of tension, the constant internal pressure to optimize, to improve, to stay ahead quietly faded. Not because his life became easier, but because something inside him stopped insisting on being the version that held everything together. For years, his identity had been clear. He was the problem solver, the one who could figure it out. The one who stayed composed while others panicked. That role had served him well. It gave him stability, recognition, a sense of control. But it also required maintenance, vigilance, a constant reinforcement of who he believed he had to be. Now, that reinforcement felt unnecessary. He didn't reject the identity. He didn't dismantle it. He simply stopped feeding it. And without fuel, it began to soften on its own. This softening wasn't collapse. It wasn't confusion. It was spaciousness. Reactions that once felt compulsory became optional. Thoughts that used to dominate lost their authority. He could feel emotions arise without needing to resolve them immediately. There was no urgency to label, fix, or explain what was happening. That was surrender. Not the kind that gives up, but the kind that releases the need to control outcomes rooted in an outdated state. He wasn't surrendering his direction. He was surrendering the version of himself that believed struggle was required for progress. As that belief loosened, the world around him grew quieter. Conversations slowed. Decisions simplified. Situations that once demanded his attention dissolved without confrontation. It felt as though the old timeline was slowly unplugging, losing power as his identity stopped sustaining it. There was a brief period of disorientation. Not fear, but unfamiliarity. The familiar markers that once told him who he was no longer worked. Achievements didn't define him. Plans didn't anchor him. Even certainty felt optional. This was the gap, the space between timelines where the old no longer holds and the new hasn't fully stabilized. Many people rush to fill this space. They distract themselves. They force clarity. They grab the nearest familiar role just to feel grounded again. He didn't. He stayed. He allowed the stillness to do its work. He let the nervous system recalibrate without rushing it back into productivity. He trusted that the absence of urgency wasn't emptiness, but preparation. During this time, synchronicities increased quietly. Not dramatic signs, subtle confirmations. A message arriving at the exact moment a thought completed. An opportunity appearing without effort. Support emerging where resistance once lived. None of it felt miraculous. It felt coherent. He understood then that surrender wasn't passive. It was active alignment, a conscious choice to stop reinforcing the emotional patterns that kept selecting the same reality. The old timeline didn't end with a bang. It ended with a loss of interest. The habits, conversations, and expectations that once defined his days no longer resonated. He didn't need to cut them out. They fell away naturally, like outdated code deprecated by a new system state. And in that letting go, something else began to take shape. Not a goal, not a plan, a presence. a steadiness that didn't depend on external validation, a sense of direction that didn't require explanation. He wasn't waiting for permission anymore. He wasn't bracing for impact. He was simply aligned. This was the moment the quantum jump stopped being an idea. The old identity had loosened its grip. The field was free to reorganize. And the new timeline, no longer resisted, was beginning to pull him forward with quiet inevitability. And that's when he realized the shift had already crossed a line he didn't know existed. He didn't notice the moment the shift became irreversible. There was no line in the sand, no announcement, no dramatic realization. It revealed itself only later, in a simple and unmistakable way. He couldn't go back, not because the old life had disappeared. It was still there, accessible, familiar, functional. But the version of him that could inhabit it no longer existed. The emotional gravity that once pulled him toward old patterns had dissolved. The thoughts were still available, but they felt distant, like reading a script written for someone else. This was the inevitability principle made real. Once a certain level of coherence is reached, the old timeline can no longer sustain the frequency of who you have become. Not out of punishment, not because you chose correctly or incorrectly, simply because resonance determines compatibility. A higher frequency does not argue with a lower one, it moves on. If you're still listening at this point, let's slow down for a moment, because what comes next isn't philosophy. It's an explanation for something you've already felt. When I say this, I'm not claiming the universe is literally shuffling you into a different physical dimension like a movie scene cut. I'm pointing to something we actually understand from neuroscience, physiology, and behavioral science. When your internal state becomes more stable and integrated, the patterns that used to run you lose the conditions they need to keep reproducing. In plain terms, your old life isn't held together by fate. It's held together by loops, attention loops, emotion loops, prediction loops, and the actions those loops trigger. Once those loops stop firing the same way, the external pattern can't keep assembling itself around you with the same precision. Think about it through the lens of the brain as a prediction machine. A large part of what you experience as reality is your nervous system constantly predicting what's about to happen, based on what has happened before, then updating those predictions with sensory feedback. When you've lived in chronic stress, chronic self-doubt, or chronic hypervigilance, your brain learns a particular model of the world: what's safe, what's threatening, what you can expect from people, how much you should hope for, how much you should brace. That model becomes efficient, automatic. You don't have to consciously choose it. It chooses for you. And once it's running, it starts recruiting evidence to keep itself true. Now, here's where coherence matters. Coherence, in a grounded sense, is when your internal signals stop fighting each other. Your thoughts are not pulling one direction while your body is bracing in another. Your intention isn't saying move forward while your nervous system screams stay safe. When you practice regulation breath, attention training, emotional processing, values-based action, you reduce internal noise. Your physiology stabilizes. Your threat response becomes less reactive. Your attention less hijacked. And when predictions change, perception changes. When perception changes, choices change. When choices change, the environment you create, relationships, conversations, opportunities begins to reorganize around that new pattern. This is why the old timeline can't sustain you. It depended on you being predictable in a specific way. It depended on you reacting on cue, interpreting through the same lens, choosing the same familiar compromises, repeating the same micro-avoidances. But when your baseline state becomes more coherent, Those triggers don't land the same. The emotional reward of old coping strategies disappears. The nervous system stops getting the same chemical payoff from familiar stress. You don't get pulled into the same arguments, the same spirals, the same urgency. That's not mystical. That's conditioning and reinforcement losing their grip when the underlying state changes. And resonance, used carefully here, is simply a way to describe compatibility. In physical systems, when two oscillating processes are in sync, energy transfer is efficient. When they're not, the coupling weakens. In human terms, when your internal state is synchronized thoughts, emotions, behavior aligned, the coupling between you and old patterns weakens. Those patterns require your participation to keep repeating. If you no longer provide the same participation, attention, interpretation, reaction, the loop can't complete itself. It either dissolves quietly or collapses after a brief escalation. So when we say a higher frequency does not argue with a lower one, it doesn't mean superiority, it means incompatibility. You stop negotiating with the part of you that needs to relive the past just because it's familiar. You stop debating triggers as if they deserve a seat at the table. You observe them, regulate, and choose again. Over time, the brain updates its model. New pathways strengthen through repetition. Old pathways weaken through disuse. This is neuroplasticity in action, the nervous system reorganizing around what you repeatedly embody. That's the science-shaped version of inevitability. Not a cosmic reward, but a system shift. When the internal model changes enough and stays changed long enough, the old outcomes become harder to reproduce because you no longer supply the same inputs. You move on because the pattern can't run without you, and you no longer need it to. Now, back to Ethan. What surprised him most was how ordinary it felt. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. Challenges still appeared, uncertainty still existed, but his relationship to them had changed fundamentally. He no longer reacted from survival or anticipation. He responded from presence. Decisions arose cleanly, without the internal friction that once accompanied every choice. He noticed how his days reorganized themselves without effort. The right conversations happened naturally. The wrong ones faded without conflict. Opportunities aligned not because he chased them, but because he was no longer misaligned with them. There was no sense of arrival, only a steady feeling of being exactly where he needed to be. This was stabilization, not holding a peak state, not maintaining constant clarity, but returning, again and again, to the same internal frequency. Coherence became less of a practice and more of a baseline. When he drifted, he noticed quickly. When fear surfaced, it passed without taking over. When doubt appeared, it didn't define direction. The future no longer felt ahead of him. It felt present. He realized that what he once called destiny wasn't a fixed outcome waiting at the end of time. It was a timeline that matched his highest coherence, a version of reality that had always existed, patiently unavailable until he became compatible with it. And now, compatibility had been established. There was a quiet sense of recognition in this phase. Familiarity without memory, as if the life unfolding around him wasn't new, but remembered, not intellectually, but somatically, in posture, in breath, in the way his body moved through the world without bracing. This wasn't about becoming extraordinary. It was about becoming congruent. The quantum jump, he finally understood, had never been a leap into the unknown. It was a return, a recalibration to a frequency he had touched many times, but never held. And now that he was holding it, the world reflected it back with increasing clarity. He stopped asking where he was going. That question belonged to a version of himself that believed time was linear and identity was fixed. Now, movement felt layered and alive. Each moment selected itself through coherence, not effort. And in that understanding, there was a deep, settling peace. He hadn't forced a new reality into existence. He had stepped out of the way long enough for the right one to take shape. The jump hadn't happened because he tried harder or believed more intensely. It happened because the version of him who belonged to that timeline finally stayed. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was the moment the journey stopped feeling like a search.